First round NFL draft review. Hi, welcome to the Schatz and Tanier NFL podcast from FTN Fantasy for April 25th, 2025. I am Aaron Schatz. You know me as the DVOA guy from FTN Fantasy. He is Mike Tanier. You know him from his Substack at miketanier.substack.com. And we are joined for our draft retrospective by Benjamin Robinson of Grinding the Mocks, who's here to talk about who rose and who fell in the draft. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart. We're going to talk about the big trades. We're going to talk about who's left on day two. All of that is coming in a couple of minutes. Don't forget, you can make comments and ask questions if you are watching us live, which we do Thursdays at 11 a.m., especially once we get closer to the preseason. Before that, we want to tell you that the show is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. There is no better way to get ready for the incoming rookie class than with Underdog Fantasy. It is the easiest place to play fantasy sports and the fastest growing app in the industry. Underdog offers a new customer FTN special with up to 100% match bonus on your first deposit. The Underdog app is easy to use, and best ball season has already started. With just a $10 entry, you could take part in the big board draft with a total of $2 million in prizes. You want Ashton Genty? Get him. Marion Hampton? He's yours.
Ooh.
Head over to Underdog for a 100% deposit match when you sign up with code FTN. NFL draft season is here, and who better to celebrate with than Underdog Fantasy? So it was kind of chalk in most ways. There are a couple of exceptions, but Ben, 28 of your top 32 expected players went in the first round.
Yeah, it was a good night. I mean the draft was pretty chalk at the top. I think the top four players went as expected, and then starting with the big trade that Jacksonville and Cleveland did upset the balance a little bit when it came to where Mason Graham was getting slotted. Mason Graham, defensive tackle from Michigan, ended up being the 5th overall pick to the Cleveland Browns.
Which I think people expected. They just expected he was going to be the 5th pick to the Jaguars.
In the days leading up to the draft, there was a lot of talk about, the Jaguars were going to be hitting an offensive player and that they wanted to make a splash. And so the big talk was Ashton Genty to the Jaguars at 5. And then once it became, there was no one saw this coming. I think if people had saw this coming, then I think Graham would have been slotted higher. But he was one of the biggest fallers leading into the draft because of that. You kind of saw him potentially in some leading mock drafts going as far down as San Francisco at 11.
Yeah, if you looked at the mocks going in, I mean, not the mocks, the sports books, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in exact order, it had, Ward, Hunter, Carter, Campbell pretty much locked in. And then the number 5 yesterday was Genty at like minus 130. But the second choice was Graham at the number 5 at like plus 285. So those were the two choices at number 5. So the second most likely one, according to the books, is the one that happened.
I mean, I think we've known for a while that Shedeur Sanders was not going 2 or 3. But let's talk about that. I think the biggest story of the night is the quarterbacks and the Hunter trade. So let's do the quarterbacks first and then the Hunter trade. Mel Kiper is clearly really close with Deion Sanders because he was losing his freaking mind. And he's right when he says that there is a history of pocket quarterbacks who drop a little bit in the draft who end up being very good in the NFL. He's wrong when he mentioned Peyton Manning as one of them because you can't drop to the number 1 overall pick. That was kind of weird. But Shedeur Sanders had to sit there and watch as every other quarterback every other team passed him, teams that needed quarterback passed him. And then the Giants, who traded up to get a first-round quarterback and did Jackson Dart instead of Shedeur Sanders. And the word, and Matt Lombardo wrote about this, the word was that Sanders' interviews just came off as arrogant.
Yes. And if you mentioned that he came off as arrogant, apparently, according to Jared Bell, Deion Sanders called you or called your boss and said, "Why did you say that?" If you thought that you were the person doing it. So you have this double whammy as however Shador was coming across in those interviews, and clearly he was rubbing some people the wrong way. Dad tried to solve the problem by making a bigger stink about it. And again, he was telling Jared Bell about it as recently as last week, how he was calling these coaches. You can imagine how this double whammy, combined with questions about Sanders' overall game, takes somebody who might have been like that marginal first round pick, or the guy you take in the first round because you need a quarterback, and takes him to where we are now.
I know that before the draft. Sorry, Ben. He had been dropping in the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah. So the narrative in the mock draft data showed that basically once it became really clear, and I think it had been clear for a while, but people really start dialing in this week, that Sanders was not going to go to 3 at the Giants. Mm-hmm. People were just laser focused on him at 21 to Pittsburgh.
Right.
And then once that happened, there were folks who predicted 3 quarterbacks, but they almost always predicted the Saints or the Giants trading into the first round to pick a Jackson Dart. And so when the trade happened, I kind of thought, oh, well, maybe they are coming for Sanders, but it kind of felt more likely that when they were trading up, they were going for Dart. And so once Sanders kind of fell past 21, I think that it was that was all she wrote for him for the first round. And so I even in my, I have the model on my website, grindingthemocks.com, had him at 21. Mm-hmm. I have a more advanced model that I don't release publicly, and I work with teams with, and that had him going in the early second round. Okay. So it's tough. I feel bad for Shador. I think he's very misunderstood, and I think that some of it has to do maybe with his dad.
Yeah.
I thought overall had a productive college career. You can talk a lot about his background, but he's a competitor, and so I hope that he goes really early in round 2, because I think he adds a lot of value in terms of the premium positions. Quarterback is the big one, so I could see Cleveland. Cleveland has 2 picks in this top of the second round after this trade with Jacksonville.
Yeah, I mean, if his father's not there, I think he's a Steeler. If his father's not there,
I'll attribute this to Ben Solak, but I don't think he was a fit with the Steelers because Arthur Smith wants to throw the ball deep with play action, and he's much more of a West Coast type quarterback, not a throw the ball deep quarterback.
I think his deep ball is fine when he's set in the pocket and he's firing it off. And he's not running every which way in circles. He needs development, and I think Steelers, from that culture standpoint, could have been that development place. Obviously, the Saints could have grabbed him just because they need a guy, and they still need a guy right now. I really think that, and they work in synergy. It's I'm not sure what to think of Shador. He's misunderstood. I get that. I agree with that. And then you have this other layer. Is this guy going to mature, or am I going to see this other side of him, or am I going to see his father? And that's the thing that I think that the NFL, all these decision makers, particularly the Giants, where Brian Daboll can't afford to be making mistakes right now. He has to go and get what John Mara likes, which is a kid from Ole Miss who looks like Eli.
I think there's a schematic piece to this too, with the Giants and Jackson Dart. Jackson Dart he's more of a style of the, people are going to compare him to Josh Allen, but like Daniel Jones, who he can throw the ball pretty good, and he has that running RPO ability. I was seeing a lot people saying, I watched Jackson Dart and I saw Josh Allen, and I just feel like
that's a really high ceiling.
Hey, that's what Todd McShay said. That's what I'm saying. But so to me, the thing that lines up really well actually is you talked about West Coast timing. I think that the Browns, Kevin Stefanski's team probably lines up pretty well with what Shador Sanders can do. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was where they went.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was the first pick of tonight. Yeah, no. Right? I think the Browns have pick 33. Why wait? If you think that Shador is good enough to be your starter and he's better than Kenny Pickett, and I think most of us feel that Shador Sanders is better than Kenny Pickett, take him with 33. And then if Cleveland doesn't, the Raiders can take him at 37 and develop him behind Geno Smith. Yeah. The Saints are at 40. and maybe would want to move up a couple spots to get past the Raiders to take him. And then again, the middle of the round doesn't have teams that need quarterbacks. So after that, you're talking about maybe some kind of trade if he wants to go in the middle of the second round.
I feel like he has to go at the top of this round. I think because the return on investment, the risk management, all those things change a little bit when you've already brought in your top guy, your Mason Graham. You've acquired extra picks, etc. And then you're now it's a risk management standpoint where all our eggs are not in this guy and developing him, and that's where the Browns would be. That's where the Raiders would be.
And the thing that I see too with I think this is the real cruel irony is like we could have been even in a situation where the Browns had Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders.
Yeah.
Instead, they might end up with Mason Graham, Shedeur Sanders, and a bunch of picks. And if I had to pick that, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, love it. I love it.
We'll get to the Travis Hunter thing in a bit. Bill Houston says, what could go wrong with Shedeur going to an organization like the Browns with high character people like Jimmy Haslam and Deshaun Watson? Well, hopefully Haslam doesn't do anything with quarterback development. You're not a Jackson Dart fan, so before we move on to the Travis Hunter trade, Mike, we need to get your feelings about the Giants moving up to take Jackson Dart as their quarterback of the future.
Benjamin just said it. It's like Daniel Jones again. I mean, that is what his scouting report kind of looked like to me. That is what he looked like to me. I cannot imagine saying we're going to trade up. We're going to make this guy the potential quarterback of the future. We're going to risk our future on this individual. We're going to risk an extra third-round pick on this individual. This is a guy who I don't think handles pressure very well. I think that is a huge problem for him. He's going for a team that has had historically offensive line issues, and then you have this sort of added New York element to things. I don't know how he fits with the guys in there with Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. So it's not mind-boggling because it's very much on brand for the Giants. This is their kind of quarterback. Literally, this is like what Mara likes. But I hate the pick. I absolutely hate the pick.
The process, I think, was good in terms of the trade. When you saw the trades up in this draft, when you do want to trade up into round one, you want to trade up for a quarterback. And so I think when we talked about this 2 weeks ago, we said they have two veteran QBs in free agency, so they don't have to rush Dart in. But I think they're in a position where they're making good moves, but it might be for guys that have their jobs in the future.
Right. By the way, my favorite is, they get the 5th round option on Jackson Dart. This is the team that had the 5th round option on Daniel Jones, didn't exercise it, let him have his kind of sort of okay, good year, panicked, and signed him to $160 million. I don't even trust the Giants with a 5th-year option as like this extra little bonus thing that they're going to deploy properly.
So the Travis Hunter trade, again, the Jaguars got number 2, a 4th-round pick, a higher 4th-round pick than the one they give up, and the 6th. But they give up 5, 36, the 4th-round pick, and then they give up next year's 1st-rounder to the Browns. I thought that I understand why the Jaguars did. I feel both teams just needed lots of players. So I feel like the Browns won by getting more draft capital, but I understand why the Jaguars did it. The idea, Travis Hunter is a very special player, especially if you think you can make the two-way thing work. There were only 3 players in this draft that people thought were really that special. Move up to get one of them. I understand what they did.
Let me ask both of you guys this. How close do you think the Jaguars really are to competing? They seem to think they're pretty close. How close do you think they are?
I think on offense, if they got better on offense, I think they'd be better. I think one of the problems is the lack of receiving options. So with the emergence of Brian Thomas Jr. this year, it has to make you feel good that they really need a secondary option that's not Christian Kirk. And so I think there's an argument around kind of what you said, Aaron, about who is the likelihood of being a superstar in this draft. And even like some of the research on, draft curves that Mike Lopez had publicly done before he became the head of the analytics at the NFL about superstar likelihood. It feels like Travis Hunter is one of those guys who could be a superstar. And I don't buy into he's worth 2 first-round picks because he played corner. But I think this is we believe if we gave Trevor the kind of weapons that he hasn't had, that, he could be better. And so like the free agent wide receiver signings, Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis, like those are not the guys.
Right.
Give him another guy, and then the defense, hopefully gets better. But the offense, they have an offensive-minded head coach again. They're really just like pushing all the pieces in, which I think is the right thing to do early in the year, especially if you have a quarterback of the new general manager, head coach regime.
Michael Allen Brewer says they just have to be better than the other teams of the AFC South. And I would say I was surprised that our early projections were not high on them, because when I was thinking about who's going to be the team this year that comes from not being in the playoffs to being in the play, my thought was, Houston's going to see their defense regress. Mm-hmm. And Jacksonville's got the hot new offensive coach. Mm-hmm. And they've got Trevor Lawrence, and we all believe that Trevor Lawrence should be better than he's been. And Brian Thomas is great. And my thought was kind of subjectively that I did think Jacksonville was a contender. And I think they're even more of one now. But I will point out that the early statistical projections did not see it that way. It's more of a subjective feeling that the Jaguars can come up where the Texans come down.
Yeah, that's it. By the way, and Liam Cohen is a very screeny guy. He's a receiver screeny guy. Travis Hunter's a very receiver screeny receiver. I just looked at the way they have the depth charts at Arrowheads. They put Hunter as number 1 slot receiver, and then they put him as a backup corner. Have the Jaguars said we consider him receiver first? Is that official? Okay.
Yep, that's official.
I think the receiver first. Yep.
Okay.
And that was always what made the most sense. I mean, I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how they manage that. I think it'll be a whole organizational wide effort with the training staff and with sports science, just to make sure that they don't push him too hard, going both ways right away as he adjusts to the NFL game.
Right.
The other big trade was the Falcons.
Woo-hoo!
Now, here's what's interesting. They took Jalen Walker, and then they traded up to get James Pierce Jr. They traded next year's first. Mm-hmm. And number 46. And they got 26 and 101. Who trade analysis based on the various analytical draft curves actually came out with this trade as a wash.
Really?
If you discount next year's pick by 50%, which is how people mentally tend to discount next year picks, then it comes out as a wash. If you don't discount next year's pick by 50%, and you consider that next year's draft is considered better than this year's draft, and that the Rams are going to need a quarterback in a year, then this comes out, I think, as a big win for the Rams.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the same thing. Like, it really depends on how much you discount the pick. I think you have to ask a question: is that first round pick going to be higher or lower than where it was this year? And this year,
knowing the Falcons and knowing the NFC South, I feel like that pick is going to be 17th.
Yeah, and so I mean, in theory, then that's a good deal. But yeah, I the thing that really rubs me the wrong way is it's really, really tough to put. This puts a lot on Michael Penix's development as a quarterback for next year, and they've invested a ton in weapons with Drake London and Kyle Pitts. But to me, I think you got to call the Kyle Pitts pick mostly a wash, and I would have drafted another receiver or some sort. If they were going to coming up for a premium position player, makes some sense. Maybe this is a sign that they just want to play Jalen Walker at off-ball linebacker, and that they don't view him as an edge, which is how I viewed him in my data, because everyone said that his best future position is edge rusher.
Yeah.
Kind of like a Micah Parsons situation, but not really. Then that you're trading up for a premium position, but once again, like trading up for anybody but a quarterback seems like a really tough pill to swallow when you don't necessarily know how good Michael Penix is, and if you've actually armed him enough with weapons. But the cruel irony is that people have been saying, Atlanta needs to draft pass rushers for years, and then they suddenly dip in for 2. And so that's where I find this to be another kind of like interesting scenario. And then also there's the concept of that maybe Pierce would be available later.
Yeah, and there's a lot of edge rush talent still at the board. And Pierce, in terms of like the traits, is probably better than most. There are questions about his motor, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't hate it, but it's a lot suddenly to like, oh, we're going to solve this problem all at once after we neglect for X number of years, and we're going to get basically 2 pass rushers for the price of 3.
Yeah,
because that's what it comes
yeah.
to. Yeah,
but I think this makes a lot of sense for the Rams. Basically, there's a very good chance that the Rams moved up from 101 to 46, and then swapped pick 26 this year for a pick that's higher than the 26th pick next year.
right.
So the Rams, discount, they're long-term looking, and it seems like the Falcons are short-term looking, and we usually know how that works out.
Bill Houston asks, were we surprised that Cousins and Ramsey were not traded? And is Cousins destined for the Steelers? I will say I'm not surprised, because I think if Cousins or Ramsey are traded, it will be for a day 3 pick. So I would expect those trades to happen on day 3. As good as Ramsey is, I don't think he's going for a day 2 pick. I think it's day 3.
He's moving with a contract.
As far as Cousins for the Steelers, I mean, I'd rather have him than Aaron Rodgers. But again, how much of the contract does Atlanta want you to pick up?
And every time everyone circles back to the Falcons, like an insider, they say, indications are they're going to enter the season with him as their backup quarterback, which is bug nuts. It is bug nuts. But they keep circling back, and the same result keeps coming out of their camp. Now, are they playing chicken? Or are they playing hard to get? I don't know. But, like, I'm geared up for this as the possibility that they think it's going to be okay to have this incredibly pricey veteran hanging around as Michael Penix insurance.
I expect Atlanta to draft a quarterback on day 3 too.
Oh gosh.
I mean, Easton Stick and Kirk Cousins is the backup. Just kind of like screams that you want. I think it would be good to have pretty prudent to have another option behind Penix. But yeah, I think there have been a lot of like wishful thinking. I have no clue what the Steelers are going to do. Zero clue what the Steelers are going to do outside of draft. I think they're pretty likely to draft a quarterback today, or potentially today. They don't have a 2nd round pick. But yeah.
Now I want the Falcons to draft Shedeur Sanders so badly that you said that. Now that you said that.
People were legitimately joking last night when the Falcons traded up that is this for a quarterback? And then it's one of those things where even last year when you're talking about, people were talking about it before the draft, hey, like actually quarterback kind of makes sense here. It still makes sense. Teams are not really willing right now to draft quarterback back to back unless the quarterback is horrible, like a Josh Rosen situation. But if the quarterback is just pretty mid and has the potential to be good, they usually leave the door open for him. That's what they've done for Penix.
From the analytical perspective, it makes sense to stock up on quarterbacks. If you don't know whether Penix is going to develop, it's good to have another option. It's the Jalen Hurts thing. It's a good idea. But do you really want Dion coming in and not having him start? That's not an analytical thing, but that's a problem.
And if it's Milroe or Will Howard, then you have this will be fine as long as it doesn't divide the locker room and turn into a thing where everyone's second guessing themselves, which is literally what happens 95% of the time, human nature being the way it is. And
I don't know, because, I mean, the Steve Walsh and Troy Aikman thing worked out well for the Cowboys, and the Jalen Hurts thing ended up working out well for the Eagles. And
RG3 and Kirk Cousins.
Yeah, I'm more worried about Daddy than I am about the players. All right, Ben, which players surprised you in the first round? Let's start with your risers, the teams that were reaches. And then we'll do followers. Let's do the risers first.
So the biggest, reaches or risers, according to my data from last night, was Tyler Booker, guard, Alabama, at pick 12 to the Cowboys. He was one of my bigger, fallers post-combine. Just had a really horrific combine. I think a lot of people thought that he was the best guard in the class. But I think people thought that because of the athletic testing that he was going to not go as high. But he ended up going, I thought he might go in the mid-20s. So to see him go at pick 12 was really surprising. It makes you think that they really, really like him. And they've now drafted an offensive lineman, specifically an offensive lineman named Tyler, 3 out of the last 4 years. So, Tyler Smith from Tulsa, and then they had Mozzie Smith, the defensive tackle from Michigan, and then last year Tyler Guyton, the offensive tackle from Oklahoma. So that was a big surprise.
So it's like elementary school where you had Michael S. and Michael T. and Michael R. So they just have Tyler this and Tyler that.
And they had Tyron.
If it was the NBA, they'd all be Jalen. Yeah. But in the NFL, they're all Tyler.
So that was a big surprise. So I think people were taking it back.
Can I interrupt for a second, by the way? Just talking about how everyone is named Tyler reminds me of the other thing that I noticed last night. I forgot to wear my gigantic name embossed diamond necklace today.
You have 5 of them too.
God, every player had a gigantic diamond encrusted necklace. Oh my God, they're gigantic.
They're definitely showstoppers. I for a second I thought Matthew Golden was wearing a Gatorade logo on his chest, and then I realized it was probably for G for Golden.
Tyler Booker said T-book, but it was really hard to read. It took me a while to realize it said T-book.
You know what? You should at least be podcasting on a screen that is about 87 inches wide, like Dan Campbell was drafting from yesterday.
Yeah, every team. Yeah, they had the really wide computer screens. Absolutely. Yes. Okay, so who came after Tyler Booker? Who were the other big risers?
The others were Kenneth Grant, defensive tackle from Michigan, who I also had going in the kind of mid-20s, the 20s, and pick 13 to Miami. Mm-hmm. And then the last two to round up these like top 4 was Emeka Egbuka, wide receiver, Ohio State.
Going ahead of Golden in particular, I thought.
Going ahead of Golden at pick 19 to Tampa, who I had at 31. So my data thought there were going to be 3 wide receivers in round 1, but it thought that Golden was going to go before Egbuka. I think it adds a lot of questions about, the future of, Chris Godwin. They also drafted Jalen McMillan, the wide receiver from Washington last year. So they really have a loaded wide receiver room there, which I think makes sense. Continue to kind of give Baker Mayfield the best in class weapons that that he kind of needs to be successful. But it was a surprise. I think a lot of people thought Jahad Campbell was a spot there, or a guy like Jahdae Barron, who ended up going later to Denver. And then the final of the top 4 is outside of my top 32, one of the 4 outside of my top 32, Donovan Jackson, the guard, Ohio State, to the Vikings, who went at 24, and I thought was like an early second round player.
Yeah, we actually have a question from Tar Heels 84. Tar Heels 84. Do we think the Vikings better serve themselves by drafting Jackson, or did they make a mistake by not trading back for more picks? The problem with trading back for more picks last night is that a trade takes 2 sides. And I don't think anybody wanted to come up other than the Giants. And then I guess the Falcons. But I don't think there was a lot of trading. I thought when Seattle took Gray Zabel, and I was surprised he's not on the top risers, but he was generally considered an early second round pick. And when they took him, I was like, a guard here, I'm like, means you can't trade down. This is the kind of pick where what you wanted to do was trade down to about 25 and then take him there, but no one was trading with you.
Right.
So
Zabel was for Minnesota.
Zabel was considered a first round. I had him 22nd ranked in my data.
Okay, that he didn't.
But one of the things that you're noticed
that early.
No, he didn't. He went at 18. So and he was my 4th rated tackle. I haven't listed as a tackle in my data, but he'll play probably guard. For Seattle. But there was you're pointing out something that I think is true. There was a run on offensive linemen last night. There was more in the top 10 than people thought. Kelvin Banks went at 9. So it ended up, I think, going a lot faster. There's a little bit of some questioning of, well, New York did they offer the same offer to Minnesota that they offered to Houston? And if so, why didn't Minnesota take it? But I think Jackson's a fine player. He has some tackle versatility as well. This past year, when Josh Simmons, who went 32nd overall to the Chiefs, when he was out, and that's one of the reasons that Simmons fell as far as he did. Jackson came in and played tackle and looked pretty good. So I think the idea here is that you have a guy who has good guard potential and potential to be in like maybe average to above average offensive tackle. But Minnesota spent a lot of money in free agency upgrading the interior of the offensive line. This continues to be something where they invest in that. So if they did get the same offer as Houston, I think they should have taken it. But if they didn't get the offer, like Aaron said, it takes two sides to tango.
Did they get it? Is that verified?
It's
no,
not
we
verified.
don't know if they did.
Okay.
It'll probably never be verified.
It'll probably never be verified because, I mean, Houston's out there making these deals when they need offensive linemen and they're backing down and backing out. So whereas the Vikings had a little more flexibility. Jackson's, I think he's a really good prospect at 24, frankly.
Who are the biggest steals, aka the fallers? We should point out analytics have shown there really is no such thing as steals. Guys who get drafted later than their expected draft position tend to not, they tend to live up to their draft position more than their earlier mock draft expectation. But who were the four biggest fallers from last night?
The four biggest fallers, number one is Jalen Walker, the edge linebacker hybrid from Georgia, who people had kind of thought very much that he would be the 8th overall pick to Carolina, and he ended up going 15th to Atlanta. So that was a surprise. And I think that 8th overall pick with Carolina also, I think McMillan, who I really like a lot, was also mocked heavily to Dallas. And I think that influenced kind of both of these selections quite a bit. So yeah, he was my number one of these, steals or fallers, like you said. The second was Tyler Warren, tight end Penn State, who I had as my 9th ranked player, and he went 14th to Indianapolis, which was kind of they definitely zigged 80% of my weighted mock draft share in Indianapolis mock drafts were tight end.
Right.
And then the third, Jihad Campbell, linebacker, Alabama, who people had kind of very much penciled in to the Tampa Bay Bucks, ended up going 31st to the Eagles.
Right. He's got injury issues, which probably contributed to his slide. Walter Nolan, not on that list.
Walter Nolan was a big riser coming into the week. He was one of my biggest risers,
Okay.
and he went right around where I think people thought he would go, which was in the late teens, mid-late teens.
Bill Houston wants to know whether Simmons, the left tackle from Ohio State, going to the Chiefs was a steal. And why did the Eagles trade up one spot with the Chiefs to take Jihad Campbell? My guess is that the Chiefs called them up and said, hey, we're getting calls to trade up for this. Do you want to trade up to make sure you get the player you want? And
Howie was concerned they were going to trade that pick elsewhere and somebody was going to take Jihad. So Howie made the move. He expended a 5th round pick, and the Eagles are loaded with late round picks over the next couple of years. So it's not a terrible.
It was a wash. There. Yeah, not at all.
And I don't
Simmons not a steal. He was my 32nd ranked player in terms of the weighted mock draft share, like I was mentioning earlier. He was the number one player to the Chiefs. I think there's a lot of consternation of, hey, the Chiefs should take an offensive lineman. I thought if the way that the draft shook out, there might be some good pass rushers there. I thought that might be a thing. Mm-hmm. And they let those pass rushers pass them by. But tackle was the top position by far. And Simmons is the kind of guy where I think there's some concern about his health. But if he can come out the other side, he has some good potential there. But that's baked into the expectation of where he went. That was very public information.
Yeah, and Simmons went from tape in 2023, not that good. I mean, he's starting for Ohio State, but it's not that good tape. Making a big leap in 2024, looks amazing, gets injured.
He transferred to Ohio State this year from San Diego State.
That's right.
So, exactly. But he had really great tape, and then he got hurt. And so I think if he hadn't got hurt, he would have gotten a lot higher. And so that's sort of the discount that you get when you think about it as a steal. But there's also potential that the injury is something that maybe it continues to impact him as a pro. And that impacted another player who we'll talk about later who fell out of the first round.
Yeah. So you said 28 of 32 guys that you expected to go in the first round. Who were the expected second round picks who rose into the first round? And then we'll get into the 4 guys who dropped out.
So the 4 players who were outside of my top 32 who went in the first round, Donovan Jackson, who I mentioned earlier, who was my 38th ranked player. Tyleik Williams, defensive tackle at Ohio State, who went to the Lions, was my 42nd ranked player.
That one surprised me.
Yeah.
I thought the
Yeah.
Lions would go edge. I thought the Lions would go edge.
I thought so as well. A lot of people did, and they were the kind of guys who were available. Were also available in the mock drafts, like Donovan Ezeuwaku from Boston College or Mike Green from Marshall. And they decided to bypass both those guys and go for more of like a one technique defensive tackle in Tyleik Williams. So the third player outside of my top 32 was Josh Connerly, offensive tackle, Oregon. Who went to Washington at 29. He was my 36th ranked player. They confirmed that they got calls to trade up and did not take them. And I have been on the record with I live in the DC area, and so I've been on some Commanders podcasts, and I was on the record saying I think they should have traded back. But I think that they just the run on offensive lineman maybe spooked them, and that he was their highest rated guy, and that when they're on the clock next, that the guy they wanted wouldn't be there.
Another developmental tools and traits guy. They can stash him for a year because they've added.
Yeah, and they can keep Brandon Coleman at right tackle if they want to. Yep.
Right.
And then the final was my 33rd ranked player, and that was Maxwell Hairston, cornerback from Kentucky. This kind of reminds me of when I had 30 at the top 32, and I think we had Lewis Seen that got drafted by the Vikings, and he was my 33rd ranked player. So I kind of winced when I saw that. I was like, so close. I could have had 29 of the top 32. But Hairston, very, very fast, tested really well at the combine. Was I think a big. He was mocked a ton to the Rams, but then when they traded out of that, cornerback was always a big need for Buffalo, and so they add a guy like Hairston. It's not a surprise. I was kind of thinking they would go him, or potentially even a guy like Trey Amos from Ole Miss, who I think will also go on very early in second round.
Agreed.
And that they connect to one of the drop guys, one of the guys who dropped out of the first round. So the four guys who dropped out of the first round starts with Shedeur Sanders.
Right. Exactly, who we already discussed. The other three are Will Johnson, cornerback from Michigan, who finished this process in my top 10 of the big boards that I collect.
Yeah.
But he was one of the bigger fallers this week of the draft. He ended up being my 18th ranked player. And just his stock took a dive this week. And I think it's
really
definitely
more
because
hurt
of
than
injury.
we realized on the outside.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's injury related.
Every piece of injury news as the offseason was unfolding was a little worse. Medicals are probably very troubling.
Yeah, it's tough for him. I just kept on saying every time, hey, like this sounds like a kind of player who, like the Eagles or the Ravens, or somebody.
Packers, I thought. Yeah.
Exactly. I thought he wouldn't get past Green Bay.
Right.
So, but yeah, I think he's a really talented player. I thought when the Chargers were there, it would have made sense too, and they went running back, which is a surprise. So my feeling was that if his college head coach and his college defensive coordinator, if they passed on him, then there's probably something really troubling, and that sucks for a guy who's as talented as Johnson.
Right.
Third,
and then the third is Mike Green, edge rusher from Marshall. I think there you can argue there's a little bit of maybe a talent thing. There's the running back thing, but I think majority has to do with the off the field stuff.
Yes.
The two allegations that, like I said, I'm not going to bring up here, but that's probably something that's impacting his stock, along with the glut of the offensive lineman that went. But it seemed like he was a fit anywhere from Atlanta all the way to the end of the first round. I think it's surprising that he's available. You can attribute it a lot to the off the field stuff. And then the last on my list is Nek Emonwari, safety from South Carolina, who I think is mostly a numbers game issue. And the positional value with the offensive linemen tested really well at the combine, but even coming into the combine, he was a second round, borderline second rounder. Right. And so I kind of was surprised. I wasn't surprised when he got bumped up, but it was something that we already knew, that he was an excellent athlete when he tested well at the combine. And so to me, I kind of thought that was sort of being it was a little bit too much of a focus, because I think this is kind of always where his range was going to be, not in the middle of the first round.
He's a Patriots kind of guy. Look for him 38.
I don't know.
Vrabel and those guys liking him.
I'm sort of torn as a Patriots fan on 38, because I'm hoping Mike Green is there, but then I'm hoping that the allegations are not true. Like, right. I'm a little torn about the whole sexual assault allegations is that a player I want to root for? Would I rather root for Ezeraku if they want an edge? I think edge is a bigger need for them than safety is.
Allegations are troubling. The teams have private investigators.
Yes.
Who would know more of the like a deeper extent of what the actual information is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be more troubling than we know.
Right. It's two separate sets of allegations that are documented. There are some very undocumented allegations running around right now about some guys that are like way off the beam in terms of, we saw something on socials. This is two well-documented separate cases separated by years. It's troubling in that way that says there's probably some fire with the smoke. I mean, I don't want to speculate too much, but you can understand what teams must be thinking with this guy.
Yeah, I think especially if Ezeraku goes ahead of him, you'll really know there's some fire behind the smoke. Because
if Nick Scourton goes ahead of him, then you'll know it's an issue. Not Ezeraku in my mind. Ezeraku and him were always kind of like you could see him in the first round. Scourton, if he goes before him, if JT Tuimoloau from Ohio State goes before Mike Green, then you know that it's an issue.
Right, because you're also looking at A+ character guys there who don't on film even come close to say, I want the character guy. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
exactly.
All right, that does it for today's show. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you for listening as a podcast. Don't forget to rate the show and tell your friends. Ben, grindingmocks.com. There's no the.
Grindingthemocks.com,
right?
yeah.
Grindingthemocks.com.
Okay. Yeah, grindingthemocks.com. And I have a Substack as well. Not as cool as Mike's, but grindingthemocks.substack.com. And I'll be on the Twitter machine during the draft. But really appreciate you guys having me on as always. It's always fun to talk the draft with you guys, and I hope we have a really enjoyable rest of the draft, and look forward to seeing all of the offseason content leading into the almanac and everything that happens in the season.
Yes, and Mike will have the Substack, of course, with his big grades or whatever he calls them on Monday and Tuesday. You don't like to call them grades, but they're grades. And
You started that. We don't do draft.
Pre-order the almanac this year. We're actually doing pre-orders of the almanac on the FTN website. Jalen Carter is the cover athlete for the 2025 almanac. And you can pre-order a copy now for $35 for the electronic version. It'll be $40 when the book actually comes out. Okay. For Mike Tanier, I am Aaron Schatz from FTN Fantasy. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We will be back in a few weeks with some preseason shows. And until then, enjoy all the football.